That project has a name, the Irish DNA Atlas. Edmund Gilbert and Giampiero Cavalieri, working out of Trinity College Dublin and the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, didn't sequence the dead. They sequenced 194 living Irish people, each one selected because their family tree stayed rooted in the same region for 4 full generations. No relocations, no ambiguity about where their ancestors actually stood. Then they cross-checked that group against 2,039 people from the Wider Peoples of the British Isles dataset, published in 2017. And the number that comes out of it undercuts the tidy story Bradley's Bronze Age data seemed to promise. Here's the number: 10. Not one Irish genome, 10 distinct, geographically stratified genetic clusters. 7 of what the researchers call Gaelic Irish ancestry. 3 of shared Irish-British ancestry, each one mapping cleanly onto real regional boundaries. You'd expect a single replacement wave 4,000 years back to eventually smooth itself out into one broad national genome. It didn't. Ireland today is not one population wearing a single ancient signature. It's 10 populations, still distinguishable, still sitting roughly where their ancestors sat. This is mini twist number 2, and it lands right here, undercutting the story Theory 1 seemed to close. The Bronze Age wave gave every part of Ireland the same starting material, but it didn't give every part of Ireland the same outcome. Something kept these regions separate long enough for modern genetics to still be able to draw lines between them. The Atlas even found a hard genetic boundary running across Ulster, a border in the DNA itself, not just on a map somebody drew centuries later. There's more sitting inside that data, and it complicates things further rather than resolving them. Layered on top of the old Bronze Age base, the Atlas detects elevated ancestry components resembling populations from northwest France and western Norway. Later admixture, likely tracing to Norse Viking settlement and, in some clusters, the Ulster plantation period centuries after that. So Ireland's genome isn't one event stacked on one event. It's at minimum 3. A Neolithic population, a Bronze Age replacement, and then successive waves of partial mixing on top of that. Unevenly distributed, region by region. Layers on layers on layers. Researchers are careful here, and it's worth saying plainly, correlation between genetic cluster and geography is not, by itself, proof of what's actually driving the visible trait everyone's been asking about since the cold open. The Atlas tells you the regions are real. It doesn't yet tell you why the Black Irish look specifically tracks certain clusters and not others. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, and it's why almost nobody in this field says it directly on camera. The honest reading of the data pushes toward an inference the researchers themselves haven't published as a clean, stated conclusion. If Ireland's 7 Gaelic clusters show unusually homogeneous levels of that oldest Irish ancestry, more internally consistent, less diluted by later admixture than the shared Irish-British clusters, then the regions popularly associated with Black Irish features, the West, the Southwest, the places furthest from centuries of external settlement, aren't carrying some late foreign addition at all. They may be carrying the least diluted version of the original Bronze Age population. The deepest signal, not the newest one. No published study says this in those exact words. That's the honest caveat, and it matters. What does exist is Cassidy's own doctoral research documenting continued genetic selection in Ireland long after the Bronze Age. Genes tied to skin pigmentation and to lactose tolerance both show steady frequency shifts across the centuries that followed, meaning the population kept changing, visibly, well past the point most people assume Irish ancestry finished forming. Put those two things next to each other, cluster homogeneity in the West and pigmentation genes still under active selection for millennia afterward, and you get a genuinely open question, not a closed one. Nobody has published the sentence, "The Black Irish are the most Irish people in Ireland." But nobody has published the data that rules it out either. Sit with that for a second before we move past it. Ballynahatty, outside Belfast, 1855. A passage tomb, cut open by workmen who had no instruments capable of reading what they were looking at. Just a skull, lifted out of a stone chamber where it had waited since roughly 3300 BC. Catalogued, drawn, and shelved for a century and a half before anyone could extract a single strand of usable DNA from it. Imagine being the person holding it in 1855. No genome, no steppe migration theory, no atlas, nothing but bone and a guess. It would take another 160 years, and a laboratory that didn't exist yet, before that skull had anything left to say. Not far off the coast of County Antrim, Rathlin Island holds the other half of this story. 3 Bronze Age men, sealed together in a stone cyst roughly 2,000 years before the present. They lived roughly 13 centuries after the Ballynahatty woman, and yet genetically stand closer to a living person in Cork or Galway today than they do to her. 2 burials, 1 island, 1,300 years, and 1 entire population apart. Here's where the reframe actually lands, and it lands harder than anything so far. The phrase Black Irish has always assumed a direction, that somewhere, at some point, something foreign got added to a stable, continuous, real Irish population. Spain, the Armada. An outside contamination of an otherwise pure line. Every version of the myth, going back to the Milesians, assumes there was an original to begin with, a baseline Irishness that later got touched by something else. The genome says there was no such baseline, not on this island. Ballynahatty and Rathlin aren't 2 chapters in one continuous story, they're 2 almost unrelated populations, and the second one essentially replaced the first. The steppe migration that Bradley and Cassidy identified isn't the moment something foreign entered Irish blood. It is Irish blood, as most people would recognize it today, the whole starting point. The population that spent 2 centuries being quietly suspected of carrying outside blood may in fact be carrying the least altered version of the population everyone else descends from too. Clean reversal, not addition, origin. A researcher working adjacent to this field once put it to a colleague more bluntly than any paper would allow, that everyone in Ireland arguing about whose ancestry is more Irish is arguing from inside a replacement event nobody's family actually witnessed, because it happened to all of them 4,000 years before any of the surnames in question existed. There is no clean team to have started on. Genetically speaking, both sides of every version of this argument are standing on the same step. And that's the trouble with treating any population as a fixed photograph instead of what it actually is. A document that's been overwritten, region by region, wave by wave, so many times that even the oldest visible layer isn't the original. It's just the oldest layer anyone's managed to read so far. Ireland is not unique in this. Almost every population that imagines itself as an ancient, undiluted, original stock is really just looking at the residue of some earlier migration. It has simply stopped noticing. A moment so old it's been mistaken for the beginning. So the lie was never really about who the Black Irish were. It was about pretending anyone else on this island had a cleaner story to tell. And the deeper the genome gets read, the less that distinction survives.